The Princess Guide is a game that on the surface looks simplistic, but a cursory glance will reveal to you that there is an insane amount of moving parts going on just beyond the veil. Though the game released in Japan a fair while ago, it will only see its North American release and European release in March of 2019. It will be launching on the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 4, and it's the PlayStation 4 version that we'll be looking at today. Developed by Nippon Ichi Software and released by their American division, it was NIS America who provided the review code for this game, and like always, I extend my thanks and gratitude to them for their continuing support, even if not every review I do for them is overwhelmingly positive. Now let's start by looking at this game's story and progression, as this is the one area that I'd say is truly as simple as it looks. You basically play as your own create a character knight. As a knight, you take up the task of training 4 princesses. Which princess you start with is up to you, and there's a bit of an Octopath Traveler sort of thing going on here, where each princess starts alone and comes together later in the story. Each princess has her own personality, fighting style, and storyline, and none of them are exactly serious or groundbreaking. The first princess I trained had an obsession with eating and wanting to kill a dragon to eat its meat. The second princess I trained had some harebrained ideas about world domination. The story is a decidedly silly affair, but that's more of a strength than anything. There are a couple serious moments along the way, but for the most part, taking a more comedic and carefree approach to the writing worked to benefit its presentation a little more than anything dark or moody would have. Each character has her own ending, and it will take you around 10 hours to reach the first credit roll. To get the true ending will require you to beat all 4 character routes, plus some additional content, but this is where my one big gripe with the game comes in. Beating all 4 character routes is an exercise in patience, as it requires you to replay far too much of the game that isn't pertinent to completing the character route you're working on. This doesn't mean the game will be 40 hours because you essentially have to beat it 4 times or anything, as stages are very short, and on repeat playthroughs you'll likely just be skipping all the cutscenes you've already seen. Really, the true ending will take only about 25 hours, but of those additional 15 hours, I'd say about 9 to 10 of them are replaying the same 3 to 4 hour chunk of the game over and over. It's just a little annoying and not something I feel I personally want to have the patience for, especially where the story is probably the least rewarding part of the game. But on that, let's talk about the battle, because it's a confusing one at first, but everything is far more simple than it appears. At first, I didn't get this game at all. The tutorials for the game felt rushed, the controls were confusing and cumbersome, the interface is horridly cluttered, and before fully grasping it, I found myself both frustrated and bored. Luckily, within an hour, that frustration, the boredom, and the confusion all passed, as the various mechanics began to fall into place. As I came to better understand the game, I honestly found it rather enjoyable, and even a tad rewarding. So you have your princess, or whatever commander you've chosen to start a stage with. They all have their own attacks. Some attacks can only be cast a set amount of times based on the weapon you have equipped. Weapons that, by the way, can be crafted and enhanced using salvaged items. The princesses and commanders control almost like basic isometric brawlers. A little bit like Bastion, I guess, for anybody who's ever played that. But then following alongside our princess or commanders, we have a Vanguard of Soldiers. These soldiers aren't necessary to win stages, but they are immensely useful. Like the princesses, they have their own attacks, and each different type of unit in the Vanguard will attack differently. They will also possess special attacks that can only be used a set amount of times per stage. These Vanguard soldiers can also take over relics in stages. Relics are more often than not traps, but they can also be healing beacons. If you don't take over the relics, then they will work against you. These relics were possibly one of the most important things in my approach to combat in this game, where I found most of my kills were coming from luring enemies into these traps and springing the traps on them. This also helped me play more defensively and keep my HP up for far longer. Relics are immensely useful, which makes stages much more difficult when all the members of your Vanguard are dead and you can't take them over anymore. But if all the members of your Vanguard die, you lose more than just your ability to take over relics. For some reason, when you have no soldiers in your Vanguard, you lose your ability to dash during combat. I'm not sure why, but that's just the way it is. Dashing isn't something I really used, but it can be a useful part of combat if you want it to be. Vanguards can also be put in different formations to grant you different benefits, such as increased defense or healing capabilities. It's worth noting that even if your commander is not fighting during a stage, you can still praise or scold the princesses you're training during their missions. This does a couple of things. If you do this on the mission fail screen, you can actually revive your character, and if they're not dead, you can heal them by praising or scolding them. This makes stages very easy to overcome, and almost none of them will need to be started over. Praising and scolding both in combat or dialogue segments will also further your princess's knowledge, which plays into their leveling system. Pretty much anything in this game can be leveled up. The Vanguard members level up quickly in combat, but when they all get wiped out, their deaths are permanent, and you'll need to pay to hire new units. The princesses level up by learning new materias, then taking them back to home base and studying them to imprint what they learned as permanent stat increases. You can also equip relics and such for more temporary stat increases. The more you teach your princess, the more you earn skill points to raise your personal stats. Once a princess gains enough knowledge, you can even unlock minigames, which are not exactly fun. This one here is like destroying the car in Street Fighter, only there's no challenge to it whatsoever, and you'll likely clear the whole minigame in under 3 minutes. This one here does have a challenge, but it's more of a frustrating kind. As you move to catch the chicken, the trajectory of the chicken changes, and honestly, it's probably way easier than I'm making it out to be, but I just could not get the hang of this. Completing this one was a bit of a chore for me. Though I said earlier, I ended up finding the combat rewarding, and I truly do, as its hectic nature and constant checklist of things to keep mindful of, things like which traps you own, how many more times you can use a trap, or how many more of your special moves you can use and stuff like that. There are places where the gameplay fails a little bit, and it's mostly tied to the balance. The game is easy once you get it, and getting high-powered weapons sucks most of the difficulty out of it, yet it still manages to be fun because of how hectic everything is. However, the bosses are kind of a complete failure for me. Not only are the bosses easy, completely failing to register any semblance of a challenge, but they all seem rather slow-moving, slow to attack, and too easy to dodge. They don't have the benefit of the hectic nature of the standard dungeon encounters to make up for the lack of a challenge. They're cool to look at, but that's about it. One other thing I wasn't too hot on was the general world map and how to navigate it. Everything works on a clock. Missions will pop up on the map, and while some of them are permanent, others are only there temporarily. Enemies will also pop up and roam around, and there will also be training missions to do, chests to collect, and mystery zones to explore. This is all mostly fine. However, every time you dispatch characters and then return them to base to level up, they can't be dispatched again until a certain amount of in-game hours has passed. This seems to be done so that you can make use of other characters in battle who are not your princess and her vanguard. While your princess is in cooldown, you can send out a different commander to do missions before it disappears. However, it doesn't really work for a couple of different reasons. The biggest reason is that there's no long-term benefit to using people who aren't the princess. There's no point to level up anybody that isn't her. Given how easy most encounters are, even if your princess is low on health and you want to level her up, it's still worth it to send her in to do those temporary missions before sending her back to base. If you have already recalled her and she's in cooldown when a new mission pops up, her cooldown will end long before that temporary mission disappears. There's this whole section of the game where you can hire new commanders and stock them with their own vanguard of troops and bring them into battle, but it's completely and utterly pointless. At no point did I ever feel a desire to use anybody other than my princess factions, nor felt a need to. They were always more than enough and always available anytime I actually needed them. If there was a way to make the commander units more beneficial to use, and make the temporary missions harder to get to or overcome with the princesses, then this could have been a useful implementation. But as it is, it's just kind of a pointless part of the game, not really worth looking at. But alas, these are minor disappointments in a gameplay system that, granted, almost pushed me away, but as I grasped it, I truly enjoyed. That aside, let's look at some of the technical aspects of the Princess Guide, because there's some areas where this game is definitely not doing itself any favors. So let's get the elephant out of the room here first. The graphics. Yes, you're thinking it, and I'm thinking it. It looks like a mobile game. Absolutely, it does. I'm not keen on this aesthetic, and if the game isn't being developed for mobile devices, I think developers would be wise to avoid a style that invites that generally negative association. The UI is completely cluttered too. Everywhere you look, there's symbols, words, numbers, and icons. All of them are immensely useful, but they could be scaled down to something far less blinding, especially where the amount of sprites on screen already makes it hard to tell what you're looking at. Let's take this for instance. This number above my Vanguard's head is over here on the side as well. We don't need it in two places. This giant circle around my character with words around it can be a tiny circle with no words, and just use different colors to mean different things. To add more insult to this, there's a film over the stages that I'm assuming is there to add atmosphere, but I personally find it's kind of ugly. It makes the game look like a video with a low bitrate, and I really wish there was an option to turn it off. In general, the gameplay filters are not nice. And while most of the game's stylistic presentation on background effects during dialogue segments is pretty cool and poppin', during gameplay it's used to poor effect. At times they'll put large text on the floor beneath your character's feet, and it's just horribly obscured by your sprites and the video filters, and becomes a chore in and of itself just to read. During dialogue segments, characters bounce around in hyperspeed animation, and I guess this would be a fine artistic choice, but personally, I don't like it. I find it jarring more than anything. That aside, the voiceovers, Japanese only, are all pretty good. The translation is good, and the music is pretty good as well. The game is tough to learn, tough to get into at first, and tends to overstay its welcome by making you replay too much of it to truly see it through to the end, but overall, as I came to learn it, I found myself really engaged with the combat. Sure, even combat has a few shortcomings thanks to a cluttered interface making it hard to keep up with, and difficulty being almost non-existent at the times it should be most present, but it was a fun little romp that got my circuits firing and held my attention far more than I initially thought it would going in. Would I recommend the game? Well, it's not for everybody, but if you've played games like Penny Punching Princess before, one of the early games by the same dev team, and you liked it, give this one a look. They're similar, but this game goes far more in depth with its mechanics. I also think with how bite-sized the stages are, this would be a great game to pick up on Switch, maybe more so than the PS4 version I played. But that's all I'm gonna say on the Princess Guide. The rest is up to you folks. Thank you once again, NIS America, for the code. For the rest of you out there, if you liked the video or found it useful at all, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you can. If you really like the video, consider supporting the show on Patreon. As always, folks, thanks for watching.